Hi, it's Writing Wednesday, and I'm here in front of the Colonial Building, which in olden times used to be the seat of Newfoundland's government. On a cold March day in 1891, possibly, hopefully not as cold as today, a group of about 50 women marched here to Colonial Building and asked for the right to vote. Now, their ambitions were very modest. They wanted the right to vote in local elections only, and on a single issue, the issue of prohibition of the sale of alcohol. But it was the first time that Newfoundland women had ever demanded the right to vote. It was to be 34 years before they actually got that right, and by that time many of the women who'd marched that day in 1891 were no longer alive to see it. Well, today our provincial government meets over at Confederation Building, right behind me there, and it's led by Kathy Dunderdale, our first woman premier. In fact, as of the leadership campaign in Ontario this last weekend, half of all Canada's provincial premiers are women. 6 out of 13 if you count the territorial premiers as well. I'm sure those women who marched on Confederation Building could never have imagined that this day would come. Does that mean that we've made it? Is the feminist fight over? Now, this might seem like a bit of a digression from talking about writing, but since my novel, A Sudden Sun Discloses, deals with, among other things, those early suffragists who fought for the right to vote, I thought this would be a good time to talk about why I wanted to include that story in my novel. Of course, I don't believe that the presence of women in positions of power means that we've made it or that full equality has been achieved. In a world where women still suffer the effects of poverty disproportionately, where violence against women is still rampant, and where billions of women around the world don't enjoy the freedoms that we in the West do, we're a long way from having achieved full equality. But I still do think that the presence of women in positions of leadership does need to be celebrated. Do I love and agree with everything Kathy Dunderdale does? No, I don't. Would I be happier if our first women premier had been Lorraine Michaels, leader of the New Democratic Party, who I usually vote for? Absolutely, yes, I would. Among those 6 women premiers across Canada, there are a lot of them whose politics I don't necessarily agree with. But I still think the very fact that they're there and that they're in those positions shows how far we've come. After all, the first woman to lead a major Western democracy was British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose policies were an absolute nightmare for any left-winger like me. But I still think that her position in that role was worth celebrating, and I will celebrate any woman getting into high political position, whether I agree with her politics or not. Many of the early suffragists, including probably some of the ones who marched here on the Colonial Building in 1891, had the charming and rather naive belief that women were inherently nobler and better than men. And if women had the vote, politics would be better and society would be better simply because women would be involved and would lift everything to a higher level. The fact is, we've learned since then that women can be every bit as down and dirty as men can. They can be as reactionary and conservative. They can play nasty politics. And surprisingly, that's actually what I think is worth celebrating, because to me, democracy is about including all the voices, and that includes both the liberal and conservative voices. It includes the voices of people I may disagree with, and it definitely includes the voices of women as well as men. As a writer, I don't write from a political agenda. I don't say, oh, there needs to be a novel about suffragists, I must write it. I look at different historical time periods and events and try to see what sort of interesting characters and stories might be lurking in those events, and when I've come up with a character that grabs my imagination, then I run with the story. But I have to say I'm very glad to be writing a novel about the suffragists. I mean, at the same time as we're celebrating having all these women in public life, a woman in the United States during their last election who was a Tea Party organizer in a southern state said in a newspaper interview that the biggest mistake America ever made was giving women the vote. Now, I realize this woman represents the lunatic fringe, but in a society where anyone can still say that, yeah, I do think we need to remember the suffragists and what they fought for. Oh hey, I almost forgot to mention, bonus video this week. Tomorrow I will be posting a video review of all the books I read in the month of January, and there will be a giveaway, so check that out.